continue our conversation on governance of research, with us is Dr. Peter Ngure, Professor Peter Ngure, I beg your pardon, who is an associate professor at the Technical University of Kenya. We also have Dr. Esther Kingori, who is a lecturer at the Daystar University. Thank you for staying on with us. When we began, Professor Ngure, you mentioned that the number of PhDs we have in the country, first of all, is one, not sufficient, to influence the development of research in the country, and secondly, the quality of these PhDs in the country is wanting. Let's go back to 2014, when the Commission for University Education gave what many would term as a knee-jerk reaction, requiring local universities in the period of 5 years to ensure that all lecturers have PhDs. That was by 2018. Now, that deadline has since passed, and we do not have that many lecturers with PhDs in the country. Was Kenya shooting itself in the foot with that decision?
I think that decision was more of a dream rather than a reality, because statistics indicate that our economy requires that we produce at least 1,000 PhDs every year. And for the last 3 or 4 years, we've managed to produce an average of about 350 PhDs per year. The postgraduate students, especially the PhDs, constitute just 1% of the total university population. And the average completion rate for PhD in this country is at 6 years. There are people who take as long as 15 years to complete their PhDs. Mm-hmm. So very, very few manage to complete their PhDs within 3 or 4 years.
Right.
And so for the Commission for University Education to have mandated that by 2018, everybody teaching at the university should have had a PhD, that by itself was a disaster. Because if people really wanted to produce PhDs at that rate, you can be sure that those PhDs would be fake. Mm-hmm. Because a PhD comes through what we call a PhD journey. And the journey is long, winding, and tough. And any PhD holder will tell you it was blood, sweat, and tears to get it. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Kingori, you are a lecturer at the Daystar University. How has your experience been with your colleagues as well, and these guidelines by the higher education regulator?
I think I agree with Professor Ngure. The PhD journey is quite tedious, and I mean, if you find a PhD who is saying theirs was just smooth running, then you will question whether it's a real PhD.
Right.
So it needs, like Professor Ngure is saying, just coming up with a decision and saying by 2019 every lecturer at the university should have a PhD. Mm-hmm. I think that's not practical. CUE maybe should sit with stakeholders really and talk about the other implications of this decision.
Right, but even as we speak, debatable now is the guidelines that mandate that only PhD holders should be hired as lecturers. That is ongoing as we speak. How has that affected, say, the quality of education and the livelihoods of lecturers in the country?
Okay, as far as I know, there are some colleagues who are now trying their best to see how soon they can finish their PhD. And at the same time, doing a PhD, it's not cheap. It's expensive, right. And there aren't enough scholarships for people doing PhDs. So many of the lecturers are forced to teach, work, and still pursue their PhD. And at some point, they have to choose between, do I finish my PhD or do I cater for my other needs? Somebody has a family and other bills that they need to pay. So they can't afford to just say they won't work, they will just do their PhD. So they're trying to work and at the same time get their PhD. So that's why sometimes it's taking this long. Because ideally, if maybe someone is doing their PhD full-time, then maybe we can say 4 years or 4.5 years they can finish. But most of the students in Kenya are teaching, working and trying to do their PhD.
All right. Professor Ngure, there are those who complain that PhDs in the country take a bit too long, and that is why now you're seeing, because of the regulations there by the Commission for University Education, in their CVs, initially a PhD, a student pursuing a PhD is just a doctoral student. But in their CVs now, lecturers are writing PhD ongoing, PhD expected, just to be seen, as though they are pursuing that PhD. But what does that say about the quality then of the PhDs that we're pursuing in the country?
Thank you for asking that. In this country, people have different things that motivate them to pursue a PhD. One of it is just peer pressure. You realize probably you went to the same school with Dr. Kingori here, and she has gone to Daystar and registered for a PhD or even graduated, and you want to compete. The other reason is in some professions, having a PhD is a great advantage. You find somebody who newly graduated the PhD is promoted much faster than you, who is probably a boss, so job security. But overall, this country has moved to a platform where people really value education on one hand, but on the other hand, we compete. I would say healthy competition on one hand, but unhealthy competition on the other hand. So mere registration for a PhD program is seen to be prestigious. And yet, there's no prestige in paying some small fees and getting an admission number in a university if you know nothing about it, and also go ahead to do nothing about it. And as I said, we talk of a PhD journey. Unlike other degrees like a master's or a bachelor, a PhD requires that the holder should have contributed to new knowledge. That is the threshold for PhD. And for you to contribute to new knowledge, it takes time, it takes resources. I once undertook a survey among Carter Fellows registered in 7 different countries in our continent, and we realized that the cost of PhD research ranges between 10,000 USD to 28,000 USD, depending on what you're doing. If you're using secondary data, it will be about $1 million shillings. If you are doing high-class laboratory-based research, you'd need as much as 3 million Kenyan shillings. So for somebody to register and pay tuition fees, they probably do not know they are also exposing themselves to the danger of getting into a program that they will not afford. And I say, from experience, a good number of PhD students get stuck soon after finishing coursework, where PhD and research component. The other big group gets stuck at the proposal development stage, because that is the time when you really need to commit many, many hours, burn the midnight oil, get a lot of literature, get high quality guidance. And the other challenge, of course, is the quality of supervision. Supervisors are paid mega salaries. A professor in Kenya, my former boss, when I was working for an international NGO, would tell us that his driver earns more than a professor in this country. And so, from the outset, professors and PhD holders are not so much motivated to mentor people and take them through the journey. And apart from that, we already mentioned issues to do with infrastructure. Even just accessing internet can be a challenge to a PhD student who is probably unemployed. Then apart from that, the bureaucracies in our universities, from procurement to approving documents, even the mere registration for PhD, in some cases takes a whole year. Then if you add ethical approval, the process of seeking ethical approval for research, on average in Africa it takes at least a year, from the time you submit your proposal to an ethical review board to the time you are told, now you can go to the field and collect data. Then from the time you collect data, we have a serious challenge in terms of getting very well-trained data analysts. Most PhD students grapple or struggle with the data that they have collected, and by the time they find somebody who can work with them to draw meaning and analyze the data, time would have elapsed. Then towards the tail end of the PhD, there's a whole delay in terms of internal and external examination. I've examined quite a number of PhDs. Most of them would be between 200 and 400 pages. And for you to really find time to read a 300-page document and give quality feedback, it means, one, you've sacrificed time, and two, you must also read so that you can be able to critique what was presented. So Before you finish your PhD, sometimes most people will tell you, I wish I didn't start.
Right.
But for those who finish, it's a great joy to change your title from Mr. or Miss to Doctor.
Absolutely. Like, we have a professor, we have doctors here. Unfortunately, we do not have too much time, but we are discussing governance of research. Dr. Kingori, very briefly, your final comments on what then should be the way forward here, especially with that mandate or that regulation there by the Commission for University Education.
I feel the stakeholders should sit together and maybe come up with a reasonable timeline, rather than maybe just one party sitting somewhere and saying by this year everybody should have a PhD, because the other concern was what happens. Maybe now universities will feel pushed to a corner and they will graduate half-baked PhDs. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for speaking to us this morning. That is Dr. Esther Kingori. She is a lecturer at the Daystar University. We also have Peter Ngure here with us, who is an associate professor at the Technical University of Kenya. We are discussing research in governance and the quality of PhDs being offered in our institutions of higher learning. That brings us to another break here on News Center. Do stay with us. Still so much more on the